The War of Independence took place in 1948. And on May 14, the State of Israel was created. So the UN made a resolution declaring the creation of the State of Israel. And a big reason for this to happen was the Holocaust that took place during World War II. And so there was a lot of sympathy for the Jews after 6 million of them had been killed in the Holocaust at the hands of the Nazis. So there was an outcry for a place for the Jews, and so the State of Israel was created at that time. But on that very same day, the birthday of Israel, Israel is immediately attacked by Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt. So on every side, all their hostile neighbors attack them. So the minute Israel is created, it's time for these nations to attack, and attack they did. On the same day, Egypt attacks the Sinai and the Gaza Strip, rolling their tanks in. Also, on the birthday of Israel, Jordan concentrated their efforts in Jerusalem and the approaches to Jerusalem from the west, and they even secured the port city of Haifa from Israel, which was quite important. And then Lebanon gets into the act from the north and probes down into Israel. Iraq, which is even off our map to the east, assisted by some Syrian units, attack in the Jordan Valley. This is the day after the creation of Israel. On the 15th as well, Syria attacks Israel and concentrates their fighting in Galilee in the north. About 13 days later, Iraq attacks Israel for the second time. And then on June 6, about 3 weeks later, Syria attacks Israel for a second time. Then a day after that, Egypt attacks Israel for a second time. So the conflict just keeps on going. Every day it seems like there's a new battle and a new conflict. Well, the war finally did end, and as a result, the UN had made this partition plan, but if we compare that to what Israel was able to secure, we see that actually Israel gained more territory from the war than from the original partition plan that the UN came up with. And plus, it's not broken up into 3 separate regions. It's one contiguous region. So actually, this was a win for Israel. They gained more by this war. They didn't start. It was started by their hostile Arab neighbors, but they actually ended up victorious in this war. So this nation that was still in its infancy was able to survive and even gain some territory. Well, one of the results of the war was that Egypt conquered Gaza, or the area called the Gaza Strip. Now, we need to remember that Egypt has had a long history in the area of Gaza for over 2,000 years. And we can see that in the archaeology from that area. We see these special coffins called anthropoid coffins that look very Egypt-like. I mean, you don't have to be an Egyptologist to figure this out. You can look at these and say, oh, they look Egyptian. And so these were found there in the area of Gaza. So Egypt has had a long influence in that area. Here's a close-up of one of those coffins, and even the hairstyle, the way the ears are drawn and whatnot, we see this is definitely of Egyptian origin. The jewelry that was found in these tombs in the Gaza area was also quite Egyptian in terms of their style. So we see Egyptian influence there. Inside one of the anthropoid coffins was what they think is a husband and wife. They call it the Romeo and Juliet. And so they were buried side by side in this anthropoid coffin. And here are the archaeologists uncovering one of these anthropoid coffins there. And so it has a figure of a person on the outside. Well, a result of the 1948 war was that Jerusalem became a divided city. The eastern portion remained under Arab control. The western portion now came under Jewish control. So you can see there on our map the kind of golden color. You see that wrapping right through Jerusalem. So the border went right through the center of Jerusalem. And here's a detailed map of Jerusalem with the light blue area being the Israeli side, the orange side being the Arab side, and then the pink is kind of a no man's land in between. So Jerusalem got divided up. In the old city, where the Temple Mount is today and where the temple originally stood, was under Arab control, actually Jordanian control. Well, one of the most significant developments of the War of Independence of 1948 was the creation of a refugee problem. Okay, the Arab nations had said, to the Palestinians, flee your homes. We're going to defeat Israel, and then you'll be able to move back into your homes. Well, the problem is some of them got displaced because Israel won that war. And so we got a lot of people needing homes, a lot of refugees as a result of the war. And this is a refugee camp outside of Tel Jericho. And so this would have been under Jordanian supervision, and really Jordan didn't do very much for the refugees. After the war, they pretty much just stayed in these refugee camps all the way up to the Six-Day War in 1967. But at this time, the refugee problem was really Jordan's problem because they were living in Jordanian-controlled areas. We see some refugee camps here in the West Bank. Some are quite large, having up to 50,000 people. The total amount in the 19 camps in the West Bank is 810,000. So quite a number of people in refugee camps. These would have been Palestinians, displaced people. And so since the West Bank was controlled by Jordan, this was under Jordanian control. But even outside of the West Bank, there were many, many refugee camps in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan. So a lot of people got displaced and as a result of the 48 war. Well, let's talk about the next campaign, the Sinai campaign of 1956. Now, since 48, since the first war, the War of Independence, Egypt had closed the Suez Canal to Israeli ships. And so this made life difficult for Israel. They still had access to the Gulf of Eilat and the Red Sea, but it did make things a lot more inconvenient not having access to the Suez Canal. We can see the Suez Canal here in this picture. But then in 1955, Egypt decided to not only not let Israeli ships use the Suez Canal, but they decided to block access to the Gulf of Aqaba at the Straits of Tiran, that narrow area where they created a blockade, and so they didn't allow Israeli ships to go in or out. And so this really caused a conflict that Israel was willing to go to war for. And in fact, Israel did quite well in the 1956 campaign. They got fairly close to Cairo and were ready to invade Cairo. Things did not go well for the Egyptians. But under pressure by the UN, Israel decided to back down and did not invade Cairo. Things probably would have been a lot different had Israel invaded Cairo. The next war is the most determinative war of all the wars, modern wars in Israel, in terms of borders. This war really drew the map, okay? And the borders that this war established are pretty much the borders today. And this war only lasted 6 days, if you can believe that, in June 1967. Well, let's look at some of the events leading up to the war. In 1966, Egypt and Syria decided to sign this Egyptian-Syrian defense agreement. And it really wasn't a defense agreement. It was, how can we win back the territories we lost to Israel? It was more of an offensive agreement. And so they were just waiting for the opportune time to attack Israel. And then in 1967, on May 14th, Egypt mobilizes its forces in and around the Suez Canal. They roll their tanks into the Sinai on the 16th, and they demand that the UN peacekeeping forces, the UN emergency force, leave. And so they gave them an ultimatum. And so 3 days later, the security forces of the UN decided they better leave. Okay, they knew that there's no way that they could withstand the entire Egyptian army. So the only peacekeeping forces left departed the country on the 19th. On the 22nd, Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran. And for Israel, this was a casus belli, that is, a cause for war, a justification for war. So this was the last straw. And so they realized that we are going back into war. Well, here are some of the events leading up to the Six-Day War from May 24th to June 4th. So all the neighbors around Israel, all the countries in close proximity to Israel, decide that they are going to attack Israel. And so we have the Lebanese army coming in from the north, the Syrian army coming in, the Iraqi army comes in, the Jordanian army, even the Saudi Arabians got involved. So we got the Egyptians, we got all these countries to the east, all putting pressure and mounting their forces against Israel. So Israel, they have military intelligence, they know what's going on, and they could see, all right, we could wait for our enemies to attack, and we would be mainly unprepared, or they decided we need to launch a preemptive strike. It is inevitable that war is coming, and it's better that we strike the first blow. So that's what they decided to do. And so the Israeli Air Force goes over to Egypt and bombs the Egyptian air bases on June 5th, 1967. And so the entire Egyptian Air Force was destroyed on the ground. And if you know anything about modern warfare, you know that whoever rules the skies will win the war, because even things like soldiers and tanks on the ground are easy targets for jets dropping bombs from above. And so in this slide we can see some of the Egyptian aircraft destroyed on the tarmac at these air bases. And you can even see the shadow of the Israeli plane there. It's a mirage with its very distinctive delta wing, like a triangle, there in this picture. So Israel was very successful in totally decimating the Egyptian Air Force. Well, things went well for Israel in the Six-Day War, even though it lasted just a short time. Some of the results were that Israel takes and occupies the Gaza Strip. So they won that from Egypt. So we can see the Gaza Strip there in the bottom left of our map, outlined in kind of that violet color to show you that that formerly was part of Egypt. Israel also takes the entire Sinai from Egypt, which was a huge gain. And this provided a protective front for Israel, kind of pushed the Egyptians farther back. And then in the confrontation with Syria, Israel takes and occupies the Golan Heights. Well, let's talk about the strategic importance of the Golan Heights. You can see in this slide that the Golan Heights is north and east of the Sea of Galilee. And it's important for three reasons. It's a defensible border against invasions by land. Secondly, all of northern Israel is within range of direct artillery fire from the Golan Heights. And then thirdly, it controls the main sources of water for Israel. So three big reasons why the Golan Heights is important. And what I want you to understand is the geography of the Golan Heights in comparison with the Sea of Galilee, which actually sits in a basin. It's actually 200 meters below sea level. And so the Golan Heights kind of towers over the Sea of Galilee. And we can see this red line indicates a cross section there. And as we look at the diagram in the lower portion, we can see there's the Sea of Galilee at the bottom, and then up on the hills of the Golan Heights was a Syrian base. And from that vantage point, they could easily fire down on the Jewish farms down on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. So it was very important that Israel control this area. Here we are looking to the southeast from the northern edge of the Sea of Galilee, looking back on the Golan Heights, and you can see how it slopes down to the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and then there's the farms there. And so from that vantage point up there on the Golan Heights, the Syrians could shoot down on the Israelis very easily. You can see in this slide how the Golan Heights is quite high and looms over that area. Here's a abandoned machine gun from Syria that they used to use to shoot down on the Jewish farms down below at the shore of the Sea of Galilee. So Israel felt it's very important, it's imperative that they control the Golan Heights. And to this day, watch your step in the Golan Heights because there's still a lot of mines there. The Syrians planted a lot of mines, and so it's a dangerous area, so only walk on the designated paths if you make a trip to Israel. Another advantage to our class is you don't have to worry about minefields. If you went to Israel, you might have to worry about that. Okay, so here we are looking to the northeast in the Golan Heights, and you can see it's wide open, it's a fertile area, and so easy to head up to Damascus, or the reverse is also true. The Syrians could roll their tanks from Damascus and come and make their way to the Golan Heights very easily. So Israel feels like they must have this area as a buffer zone between them and the Syrians. Another piece of territory that Israel won in the 67 war, in addition to the Gaza Strip and the Golan Heights, was the West Bank, including the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem became a unified city. So we see there the West Bank outlined in green, indicating that it was won from the country of Jordan. And when you look at that, when you hear the term West Bank, you may think, oh, that's just a little narrow sliver of land on the west side of the Jordan River. No, if you look at this, it's a huge piece of land. Takes up a good portion of the total area of Israel. So it's a very large chunk of land. And so it's what the Jews call the hill country of Samaria and the hill country of Judah. And so before the Six-Day War, Jerusalem was a divided city. Israelis on the west side, Arabs on the east side. And then after 1967, because of the Six-Day War, Israel was able to unify the city of Jerusalem. They considered it their capital, and so Jerusalem became under Israel occupation and Israel control. But a big problem that Israel inherited as a result of the Six-Day War was the refugee problem. Remember, that was created after the 48 War, but that was Jordan's problem because Jordan had control over the West Bank. Now Israel has just won control over the West Bank, and so Israel has to deal with this huge Palestinian refugee problem in the West Bank. So Israel inherited that problem as a result of the Six-Day War.